Castien Varo had always thought cryosleep felt like drowning in reverse. Water pulled from your lungs instead of forced in. Consciousness retreating to some small corner of your brain, where time meant nothing and dreams tasted like copper. He'd done it a dozen times before. Standard protocol for solo salvage runs when your ship decided to hemorrhage coolant halfway through the Veil Nebula, and your only choices were freeze or asphyxiate. The pod had sealed with its usual hiss. The neural suppressor had kicked in with that familiar pins and needles sensation behind his eyes, and he'd gone under thinking about whether his insurance would cover catastrophic navigation failure, or if he'd have to argue with some desk jockey about the definition of pilot error. He did not expect to wake up on a floor made of black glass. The first thing that hit him was the smell, not the usual antiseptic tang of cryo-recovery or even the stale recycled air of a rescue vessel, but something older, like a library that hadn't been opened in centuries mixed with burnt ozone. The second thing was the cold, not the manufactured chill of climate control, but the deep, bone-soaking cold of stone that had never seen a sun. The third thing was the candles. Castien lay there for a moment, staring up at a vaulted ceiling carved from obsidian that reflected the candlelight in strange, shifting patterns, and tried to make his brain work. Candles. Actual candles, dozens of them, arranged in a circle around him, their flames burning violet instead of orange. He blinked. The flames stayed violet. That seemed important, probably, but his thoughts felt like they were wading through syrup. He tried to access his neural implant, the little chunk of hardware behind his right ear that should have given him the time, his vital signs, maybe a helpful reminder about where the hell he was. Instead, he got static and a timestamp that made his stomach lurch. 60 years, 4 months, 18 days since he'd entered cryosleep. The implant had to be malfunctioning. Had to be. 3 weeks, that's what his air supply had been good for. 3 weeks and then some automated beacon would ping the nearest salvage guild and they'd fish him out, charge him a ridiculous recovery fee, and he'd spend the next year hauling freight through boring, non-lethal star systems to pay off the debt. 60 years was not part of the plan. He sat up, or tried to. His body responded with the enthusiasm of a machine that had been in storage too long, joints popping, muscles trembling. He'd expected atrophy. You always lost something in cryo, always woke up weak as a kitten for the first few hours. But this felt different. Not weak, exactly, just distant, like his body was a rental he'd forgotten how to drive. "Did you dream of me?" Castien's head snapped toward the voice, and several vertebrae in his neck made crackling sounds that would have been concerning if he weren't suddenly focused on the woman standing in the archway. Woman. Person. Entity. His brain cycled through options while his mouth stayed firmly shut, which was probably for the best because his first instinct was to ask if she knew where the exit was and whether they validated parking. She stood perfectly still in the shadows just beyond the candlelight, and stillness on her looked wrong, like watching a predator pretend to be furniture. When she finally moved, stepping into the violet glow, Castien's pilot brain, trained to assess threats and categorize unknowns, stuttered over what it was seeing. She looked human, almost aggressively human, in the way that made you notice all the small things that weren't quite right. Pale skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Black hair that fell past her shoulders without a single strand out of place, delicate features that would have been beautiful if they weren't so precisely arranged. Like someone had calculated the exact geometry of attractiveness and built a face accordingly. And the ears, long, tapering to elegant points that swept back from her skull, catching the candlelight along their edges. She wore something that might have been a robe or might have been decorative shadows. Castien's eyes couldn't quite focus on the fabric. What he could focus on were her eyes, large and dark and fixed on him with an intensity that made him want to check if he'd forgotten to wear pants. He glanced down. Still had pants. Small victories. "I'll be honest," he said, his voice coming out rougher than expected. My dreams usually involve showing up to pilot certification naked and discovering the exam is actually a cooking competition. You weren't in any of those, which seems like a missed opportunity for my subconscious. She didn't smile. Didn't react at all, really, except for a slight tilt of her head that reminded him uncomfortably of a cat deciding whether something was food or a toy. "My name is Seluvraith," she said, her voice soft and measured, with an accent he couldn't place, vowels that stretched too long, consonants that clicked in odd places. "I am Nocthari. I have kept you alive." Castien processed this. Nocthari. The word pinged something in his memory, some fragment of xenohistory from academy courses he'd barely passed. An extinct species, wiped out in some ancient war that predated human spaceflight. Except extinct species didn't generally stand in front of you discussing how they'd kept you alive, which suggested either his cryo-addled brain was inventing things, or the history texts had gotten it wrong. "Kept," he repeated, latching onto the word. "That's an interesting verb choice. Usually people say saved or rescued. Kept has more of a specimen in a jar vibe to it." Seluvraith took another step closer, and Castien became aware that she moved wrong too. No weight shift, no sound of footsteps, just a smooth glide that made his hindbrain scream that something was very, very off about the local gravity or the local woman or possibly both. "You have been asleep for 60 years, she said, and the casual way she delivered this information made it worse somehow. "Your vessel never escaped the Veil Nebula. Something in the exotic matter fields disrupted your distress beacon. You drifted, eventually you came here. Here being." Castien gestured vaguely at the obsidian chamber, the violet candles, the architectural impossibilities that were starting to make his eyes water if he looked too long. "Kethshalai. This moon, this temple, my home. Right, and you found my cryopod and thought, what finders keepers. I thought you would die if I did not intervene. I thought I would die if I did not feed." She said this with the same neutral tone as if discussing the weather. "My species does not consume matter. We feed on the bioelectric patterns of dreaming minds, the neural activity during REM sleep. I needed to survive. You needed to remain in stasis. So I fed on your dreams and I kept you alive, and now you are here." The silence that followed was profound enough that Castien could hear his own heartbeat, which was doing interesting things in his chest. A rapid flutter that felt less like panic and more like his cardiovascular system trying to file an official complaint. "You ate my dreams," he said slowly. "I sustained myself on them, yes. For 60 years. Yes. So you're basically telling me you've been living in my head, watching my neural home movies without permission, for 6 decades. That is accurate." Castien laughed, a short bark of sound that echoed strangely in the chamber. "Well, that's either the most invasive thing anyone's ever done to me or the setup to the worst first date in human history, possibly both." For the first time, something shifted in Seluvraith's expression. Not quite a smile, but a minute softening around her eyes that suggested she understood humor even if she didn't practice it much. "I know you, Castien Varo," she said quietly. "I know your fear of small spaces and your guilt over the crew you could not save on Titan Station. I know you prefer coffee with too much sugar and that you once spent 3 hours arguing with a docking computer because it mispronounced your name. I know the shape of your courage and the taste of your loneliness. I have walked through 60 years of your sleeping mind." The weight of that statement settled over him like a physical thing. Somewhere in his chest, beneath the panic and the confusion and the part of his brain still insisting this had to be a cryo-induced hallucination, something else stirred. A feeling he couldn't name, uncomfortable and intimate, like discovering someone had been reading his diary except the diary was his entire interior life. "That's deeply creepy," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes," Seluvraith agreed, "but it is also true, and I need you to understand this truth because I need your help." Castien's legs decided to work properly around the time Seluvraith started explaining how her entire species had been wiped out, which seemed like poor timing on his body's part. He managed to stand, swaying slightly, one hand braced against the obsidian wall that felt unnaturally warm under his palm, as if the stone itself was alive and running a low-grade fever. "So let me get this straight," he said, interrupting what was becoming a fairly detailed lecture on ancient interstellar warfare. "Your people built these temples all over the galaxy, had some kind of apocalyptic disagreement with something that wanted them very dead, and you're the last one standing. Or floating, whatever it is you do." "The war was not a disagreement," Seluvraith said, and for the first time he heard something like emotion in her voice, a tightness, anger maybe, or grief so old it had fossilized. "It was extermination, systematic and thorough. The enemy did not negotiate. They simply erased us, system by system, world by world, until only the most remote outposts remained. This temple was forgotten, too far from anything that mattered. That is why I survived." "Lucky you," Castien muttered, then immediately regretted it when her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his survival instincts wake up and start taking notes. "Yes," she said flatly, "lucky." He cleared his throat, looking for safer ground. "Okay, so, extinction event, ancient war, you're the last space elf standing. I'm very sorry for your loss, genuinely, but what does any of this have to do with why you woke me up? Because I'm getting the distinct impression this isn't just about you wanting someone to talk to after 60 years of solitude." Seluvraith moved to the far wall where a section of obsidian had been carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to shift when he wasn't focusing on them. She placed her palm flat against the stone, and the symbols lit up with that same violet light as the candles, pulsing in a rhythm that made his teeth ache. "The temple is not merely architecture," she said. "It is a containment system. The Nocthari built places like this across the galaxy, wherever we found things that should not exist, anomalies in spacetime, entities that predated our understanding of reality, weapons too dangerous to destroy. This temple was built around something we discovered here, something we could not kill. You people had a real talent for finding trouble, didn't you? We had a talent for survival. Sometimes those are the same thing." The symbols flared brighter, and Castien felt something in his chest respond, a vibration that shouldn't have been possible. "What we sealed beneath this temple has been dormant for millennia. The containment was designed to last until the heat death of the universe. But the moon is completing an orbital cycle, an alignment of gravitational forces that occurs once every 600 years. The seals are weakening." Castien's brain, which had been trying very hard to process everything in a calm and rational manner, gave up and defaulted to his usual coping mechanism. "So what you're telling me is that I survived 60 years of cryosleep, got my dreams eaten by the last member of an extinct species, and now I'm standing in a horror movie waiting for the ancient evil to wake up. Is that about right? Your reductionism is not inaccurate. Great, fantastic. This is exactly how I wanted my rescue to go." He ran a hand through his hair, which felt strange and too long, another reminder of all the time that had passed. "What happens if this thing wakes up?" Seluvraith removed her hand from the wall, and the symbols dimmed. When she turned to face him, her expression was carefully neutral in a way that made him more nervous than if she'd been openly terrified. "I do not know," she said. "My people sealed it before they fully understood what it was. The records are fragmentary. What I do know is that it exists partially outside normal spacetime, that it was here before the moon formed, possibly before the star system formed. The Nocthari who built this temple believed it was sleeping, or perhaps waiting. They were not certain of the difference." "That's wonderfully ominous, thank you." "You asked." "I did, didn't I?" Note to self, stop asking questions when the answers involve eldritch abominations. He pushed off from the wall, testing his balance, and managed a few steps without his knees threatening mutiny. "So why wake me up? No offense, but if your people couldn't handle this thing with all your fancy dream-eating powers and reality-bending architecture, What exactly am I supposed to do about it? I'm a salvage pilot. I haul scrap and try not to die in stupid ways. Monster fighting is not in my skill set. Seluvraith was quiet for a moment, her dark eyes studying him with an intensity that made him want to squirm. When she spoke, her voice was softer, almost hesitant. For 60 years I have walked through your dreams. I have seen you solve impossible problems with insufficient resources. I have watched you talk your way out of conflicts that should have killed you. I have felt your mind work, the way you think laterally when linear thinking fails, the way you find humor in crisis, because humor is how you process fear without being paralyzed by it. She paused, and something in her posture shifted, became less rigid. And I have seen that you do not give up, even when giving up would be rational, even when giving up would be easier. You're describing stubbornness, Castien said. That's just stubbornness with better marketing. Perhaps, but stubbornness is useful when facing something that has outlasted civilizations. She moved closer, and he forced himself not to step back, though every instinct told him to maintain distance from this pale woman who consumed dreams and spoke of ancient horrors like they were bureaucratic inconveniences. I also woke you because I am alone, and I am afraid, and some part of me believed that if I had to face this, I did not want to face it with no one at all. The honesty in that statement hit him harder than any of the cosmic horror revelations. He'd been alone on the Dustrunner *, alone when the coolant line ruptured, alone when he'd sealed himself in the cryopod with nothing but a prayer to whatever god handled salvage pilots. He knew what alone felt like. He knew what it did to you. Okay, he heard himself say. Okay, let's say I help. Let's say we go poke whatever nightmare is sleeping under this temple and try to convince it to keep sleeping. What's my incentive here? Besides not dying horribly, which is admittedly compelling, but I'd like to shoot for something more aspirational. For the first time since he'd met her, Seluvraith smiled. It was a small thing, barely a curve at the corner of her mouth, but it transformed her face from something alien and unsettling to something almost familiar, almost warm. If we succeed in reinforcing the seals, I know of a Nocthari cache station in a nearby system. Ancient, possibly still functional. It has a subspace relay that might reach human space. It is a small chance, but it is more than you have now. So you're offering me a maybe, a possibly, and a might. You really know how to sell a death-defying adventure. I am offering you hope. That is more than most people receive. Castien laughed, a real laugh this time, shaking his head at the absurdity of his situation. 60 years gone, his ship destroyed, standing in an alien temple with a woman who'd been living in his head since before he knew she existed, discussing how to prevent an ancient cosmic horror from waking up. His life had taken some turns, certainly, but this was a new record even for him. "All right," he said. "All right, you dream-eating space elf with terrible timing and even worse luck. Show me this thing we're supposed to be stopping. But first, please tell me you have something resembling food in this temple. Because if I'm going to save the universe, I'd prefer to do it on a full stomach." Seluvraith's smile widened just slightly. "I have nutrient paste. It is 60 years old." "Of course you do. Why would anything about this situation be easy? If you've watched this far, what brought you to this video? I'd be really happy if you share it in the comments. Don't forget to like the video to support me." The nutrient paste tasted like despair mixed with artificial strawberry flavoring, which Castien supposed was appropriate given the circumstances. He sat cross-legged on the obsidian floor, squeezing the packet into his mouth while Seluvraith watched with the fascination of someone observing an alien ritual, which he supposed from her perspective eating probably was. "You don't ever miss it?" he asked between swallows, gesturing with the packet. "Food, I mean, the whole physical consumption experience." "I remember the concept," Seluvraith said. "My people ate once before we evolved past the need, but that was thousands of generations ago. The memory is genetic, not personal. That's deeply sad and also explains why you thought 60-year-old nutrient paste was an acceptable meal option." He finished the packet and immediately regretted it, his stomach sending up confused signals about whether it should be grateful or revolt. So where's my ship, or what's left of it? Because if I'm stuck here, I'd like to at least salvage my personal effects. I had a very expensive collection of terrible movies on the Asterisk Dustrunner, and I'd hate to think they're just floating in space somewhere. Your vessel is here. What remains of it? Seluvraith stood in that unsettling way she had, rising without apparent effort, as if gravity had simply decided to excuse her from participation. I will show you. But first, you should see where you are. She led him through the temple, down corridors that bent in ways his pilot's brain insisted were geometrically impossible, past chambers filled with equipment he couldn't identify, their purposes lost to time and the extinction of the species that built them. The violet candles were everywhere, burning without fuel, casting shadows that moved independently of any light source. He tried not to think too hard about that. They climbed a spiral ramp that seemed to go up for far longer than the temple's exterior would suggest was possible, and emerged onto a platform of black stone that jutted into open space. Castien stopped walking, stopped breathing for a moment as his brain tried to process what it was seeing. 3 gas giants hung in the sky above him, so close he could see their atmospheric bands churning, massive storms that would dwarf Earth entirely. They were arranged in a rough triangle, their colors ranging from bruised purple to sullen orange to a sickly green that made his eyes water. Between them, gravitational lensing bent starlight into impossible arcs, and he could see the moon's shadow stretching across the face of the nearest giant, a tiny dark spot against incomprehensible scale. This shouldn't exist, he said, his voice coming out smaller than intended. The tidal forces alone should have torn this moon apart millions of years ago. The orbital mechanics are impossible. This whole system is impossible. The Nocthari chose this location precisely because it was impossible, Seluvraith said, standing beside him at the platform's edge. The gravitational anomalies help maintain the temple's containment systems. Reality is thinner here, more malleable. That makes it easier to seal things that do not belong in normal space. You people really committed to the whole, build your prison in the worst possible location aesthetic, didn't you? We were thorough. Castien tore his eyes away from the impossible sky and looked at the temple itself, seeing it properly for the first time. It sprawled across the moon's surface like a geometric cancer, all sharp angles and impossible towers, structures that seemed to fold in on themselves, bridges that connected to nothing. The obsidian caught the light from the gas giants and turned it into something liquid, flowing across surfaces that should have been solid. How big is this place? The temple proper covers approximately 40 square kilometers. The containment systems extend through the entire moon. We are standing on the surface structure, but most of the architecture exists in subspace, overlapping with normal reality only at specific anchor points. Right, sure. Subspace architecture, why not? He rubbed his face, feeling stubble that was definitely not 3 weeks' worth, 60 years. The number kept hitting him in new ways, each one more disorienting than the last. My ship. You were going to show me my ship. Seluvraith led him back inside, down different corridors this time, or maybe the same corridors at different angles. He'd given up trying to maintain a mental map. They descended into a chamber that felt more utilitarian than the rest of the temple, a wide space with harsh white lighting that hummed at a frequency just on the edge of hearing. And there, arranged across the floor like a giant's dissected insect collection, was the Asterisk Dustrunner Asterisk, or pieces of it anyway. The hull plating had been carefully separated and laid out, revealing the ship's interior systems like an exploded technical diagram. His pilot's chair sat in the center, somehow still intact, surrounded by twisted metal and melted circuitry. The cryopod had been moved to one corner, its lid open, interior dark. Castien walked slowly through the wreckage, his hands hovering over components he'd maintained himself, systems he'd coaxed into working long past their rated lifespans. The navigation console was slag. The communications array was worse than slag, transformed into something that looked like modern art about the futility of human communication. His collection of terrible movies, stored on a personal data module that should have been in the crew quarters, was simply gone. "How did it get here?" he asked, his voice echoing in the large chamber. "You said something about spatial anomalies, but ships don't just drift through dimensions and land neatly in ancient temples." "They do not," Seluvraith agreed. "I found your cryopod floating in orbit around Castien. The rest of the vessel was dispersed across several thousand kilometers, pulled apart by the same gravitational anomalies that maintain this system. I retrieved what I could over several years. I am not a salvage pilot, so the process was inefficient. You hauled spaceship parts by yourself for years." He looked at her, this pale woman with pointed ears who claimed to feed on dreams, and tried to reconcile that image with someone doing hard manual labor in vacuum. "Why?" "Because you were still dreaming. Because your dreams suggested you would want your vessel preserved if possible. Because I had nothing else to occupy my time." She moved to the cryopod, running one hand along its exterior. "And because the act of salvaging your ship gave me something to focus on besides the increasing instability of the containment systems beneath us. So this has been falling apart for a while. The seals have been degrading since the last orbital alignment 600 years ago, but the deterioration has accelerated in recent decades. I estimate we have days, perhaps less, before catastrophic failure." Castien sat down in his pilot's chair, which creaked alarmingly under his weight but held. From here, he'd piloted the Asterisk Dustrunner through a dozen star systems, hauled enough scrap to build a small station, and generally made a living doing the kind of work that kept humanity's infrastructure from collapsing into entropy. It felt like someone else's life now, something that had happened to a different person. "You know what the really funny part is?" he said, staring at the wreckage of his ship. "I spent my entire career avoiding long-term commitments. No crew, no partnerships, no station contracts longer than 6 months. I liked being able to leave whenever things got complicated. And now I'm stuck on an impossible moon with the last member of an extinct species, about to fight something that might predate the universe, and I can't leave even if I wanted to." "Would you? If you could leave, would you?" He thought about it, really thought about it, turning the question over in his mind. The honest answer surprised him. "No," he said finally. "No, I don't think I would. Not because I'm particularly brave or noble, but because you're right. I don't give up when I probably should. It's a character flaw disguised as a virtue." He stood, brushing invisible dust off his pants, a habitual gesture from a life that was 60 years gone. "Plus, if I left you alone and this thing woke up and ate reality, I'd feel terrible about it. Guilt is a powerful motivator." Seluvraith's expression shifted into something he couldn't read, emotions flickering across her face too quickly to identify. When she spoke, her voice was quiet. "In your dreams, you died on Titan Station with the rest of your crew. You dream it often, dozens of times across the years I watched. The scenario changes, but the outcome is always the same. You do not survive. Yet here in waking life, you survived. Why? Because I wasn't there when it happened. I'd taken a shuttle to pick up supplies, got delayed by a docking error that should have been a minor inconvenience. By the time I got back, the station was gone. Catastrophic decompression from a faulty pressure seal. Everyone dead in minutes." He smiled without humor. "So I survived through pure random chance, and I dream about dying because survivor's guilt is apparently a long-term subscription service with no cancellation option." "I know," Seluvraith said. "I have tasted that guilt in your dreams. It has a flavor like copper and regret. That's poetic and horrifying in equal measure. Most truths are." They descended into the temple's lower levels at what Castien generously called early morning. though time had become a meaningless concept on a moon where three gas giants cycled through the sky at irregular intervals, and no sun ever rose. Seluvraith had explained that the moon's rotation was locked in some kind of quantum superposition, existing in multiple temporal states simultaneously, which was either deeply profound or complete nonsense. Castien had stopped trying to figure out which. "So let me make sure I understand the plan," he said, following her down a spiral staircase that seemed to be carved from a single piece of obsidian, each step perfectly smooth and exactly the same height. "We go down into the basement where the scary thing lives. We check on the seals that are supposed to keep the scary thing asleep, and then we..." "What?" "Give them a stern talking to, apply duct tape, perform an ancient ritual that may or may not involve blood sacrifice. The seals are biological mechanical hybrids," Seluvraith said without turning around, her voice echoing strangely in the stairwell. "They respond to Nocthari bioelectric signatures. I will assess their integrity and attempt to reinforce them using my own neural energy. And my role in this procedure: moral support and survival assistance if something goes wrong." "Fantastic. I'm the designated survivor. That's always a great position to have in a horror scenario." He paused as the stairwell opened into a corridor lined with walls that pulsed with bioluminescent moss, casting everything in a sickly blue-green glow. "This moss, it's breathing, isn't it? It is photosynthesizing in reverse, consuming light and producing complex organic compounds. The Nocthari cultivated it as a secondary power source for deep temple systems." "Of course it is. Why would anything in this place be normal?" The corridor stretched ahead of them, curving slightly downward, and Castien realized with growing unease that the walls were getting closer together. Not dramatically, not enough to trigger immediate claustrophobia, but enough that he noticed. Enough that his heart rate picked up and his palms started sweating. Seluvraith glanced back at him, her dark eyes catching the moss light. "Your heart rate has increased," she said, not quite a question. "Tight spaces, not my favorite." He forced himself to keep walking, to not think about the millions of tons of moon above them, the impossible architecture that might decide to stop being impossible at any moment. "It's fine, I'm fine. Just making conversation with my cardiovascular system. We can rest if needed." "No, let's keep moving. Standing still in creepy underground tunnels is how people die in every story ever told." He tried for a laugh, managed something closer to a nervous exhale. "Talk to me about something. Distract me from the fact that we're descending into what is essentially a cosmic oubliette." Seluvraith was quiet for a moment, her footsteps silent against the stone while his echoed embarrassingly loud. When she spoke, her voice had lost some of its formal edge. "What were you salvaging when your ship failed?" "Colony ship wreckage from the Exodus era. The *Meridian Hope*, lost about 200 years ago. She'd been drifting in the Veil Nebula, picked clean by previous salvagers, but my scanner indicated there was still a data core intact somewhere in the engine section. Historical societies pay good money for intact data cores, especially from the early colony attempts." He smiled at the memory, easier to access than he'd expected. "I'd been working that wreck for 3 weeks, and I'd finally found it, this little armored sphere wedged behind what used to be the primary reactor. Got it out, secured it in my hold, was feeling pretty good about myself. Then a micrometeorite the size of a grain of sand punched through my coolant line, and suddenly, my very good day became a very bad day." "Did you retrieve the data core from your ship when I salvaged the wreckage?" "I have no idea. Why are you interested in 200-year-old colonist diaries?" "I am interested in what you valued enough to risk your life for." That stopped him for a moment, there in the tunnel with breathing moss and impossible geometry. He thought about the *Meridian Hope*, about the thousands of people who'd loaded their entire lives onto that colony ship, who'd aimed for a new world and never arrived. He thought about their last messages, their hopes, Their mundane complaints about recycler malfunctions and cafeteria food, all preserved in silicon and titanium, waiting for someone to care that they'd existed. "I guess I like the idea that someone remembers," he said quietly. "That all those people who died in the black didn't just vanish without a trace. The data core proves they were here, that they mattered. Even if it's just grocery lists and birthday messages, it's proof. Then we are not so different. This temple is a data core. It preserves what the Nocthari were, even if no one remains to read it. Except you're still reading it." "Yes, except me." The corridor opened suddenly into a chamber that made Castien's breath catch for entirely different reasons than claustrophobia. It was vast, cathedral huge, the ceiling lost somewhere in darkness above them. But it wasn't the size that stopped him, it was the statues. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, arranged in concentric circles radiating from the chamber's center. Nocthari, all of them, frozen in various poses. Some stood with arms raised as if in prayer or defense. Others knelt, heads bowed. A few were caught mid-motion as if they'd been running toward or away from something. "These aren't statues," Castien said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No. They were the last garrison. The Nocthari who attempted to reinforce the seals during the previous orbital alignment 600 years ago. The entity beneath the temple was closer to waking then than it had ever been. They came here to strengthen the containment, and they succeeded." Seluvraith walked slowly between the frozen figures, her hand trailing near them but never quite touching. But the energy required to reinforce the seals was more than they anticipated. It drained them completely, petrified them where they stood. They bought 600 more years of dormancy with their lives. Castien moved closer to the nearest figure, a Nocthari woman caught in the act of reaching toward the chamber's center. Her face was locked in an expression that might have been determination or terror or both. The detail was extraordinary. He could see individual strands of hair, the texture of her clothing, even what looked like tears on her cheeks, all transformed into some kind of crystalline stone. "This is what you're planning to do," he said, understanding clicking into place. "You're going to try to reinforce the seals, and there's a very real chance you'll end up like them." "Yes, and you didn't mention this earlier because..." "Because if I had mentioned it, you would have tried to argue to find alternatives, to solve the problem in some lateral way that avoided the sacrifice." Seluvraith stopped beside another frozen Nocthari, this one younger, face smooth and unlined. "This was my sister, Kelithri. She was gifted in mathematics and music. She could calculate orbital mechanics in her head while composing songs about the stars. She chose to be here, knowing what it would cost." Castien looked at the young Nocthari's face, trying to imagine the person beneath the stone. "I'm sorry. She died so that I might live, so that the universe might continue. It seems ungrateful to have survived 600 years only to fail now." Seluvraith finally turned to face him, and in the blue-green light of the moss, she looked impossibly old and impossibly young at the same time. "But I am weaker than they were. 600 years of near starvation, feeding on scraps of ambient dream energy from passing comets and cosmic dust, has diminished me. And then I found you, dreaming, and I survived. But even 60 years of your dreams, rich as they were, cannot match the power these Nocthari had. So we're walking into a situation you don't think you can win." "I am walking into a situation I must attempt, regardless of probability of success. You are walking into a situation because you do not abandon people, even people who have consumed your dreams without permission." When you put it like that, I sound either noble or deeply stupid. Most nobility is indistinguishable from stupidity until after the outcome is known. Castien laughed despite everything, the sound echoing off the petrified Nocthari and the impossible ceiling. "Did you learn that from my dreams, or is that your own philosophy?" "Both. You thought it once in a dream about Titan Station. I agreed with the sentiment." They stood there for a moment among the frozen guardians, and Castien felt the weight of all those sacrifices, all those choices made by people who'd known the cost and paid it anyway. He thought about the asterisk Meridian Hope and its data core, about proof that people had existed and mattered. He thought about Seluvraith, alone for 6 centuries, keeping watch over something that wanted to unmake reality. "All right," he said, "show me this thing we're trying to keep asleep. Let's see what 600 years of cosmic horror looks like up close." Beyond the chamber of frozen Nocthari, the temple descended into something that hurt to perceive. The architecture stopped pretending to follow Euclidean geometry and embraced full chaos, corridors that existed at right angles to themselves, stairs that climbed downward, doorways that opened into spaces larger than the rooms that contained them. Castien's inner ear screamed protest at every step, his sense of balance reduced to wishful thinking and prayer. "This is what happens when you build in subspace," Seluvraith explained, noting his increasingly green complexion. "The deeper we go, the less normal physical laws apply. Try not to think about which direction is up." Too late, already thinking about it, currently regretting every life choice that led me here. He gripped the wall, which felt solid enough but looked like it was phasing in and out of existence. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much worse does it get? 13. Of course it does. They emerged into a spherical chamber where gravity had apparently filed for early retirement. Castien found himself floating, disoriented, grasping for handholds carved into the obsidian walls that curved away in every direction. At the chamber's center, suspended in a web of crystalline filaments that hummed with barely contained energy, was the seal. It looked organic, a membrane of translucent material that pulsed with irregular rhythms, shot through with veins of light that flickered between violet and a color Castien's brain refused to process. And beneath the seal something moved. He couldn't see it directly. His eyes slid off it like water off glass, his brain rejecting the input as corrupted data. But he could feel its shape in his mind, vast and incomprehensible, pressing against reality like a hand against wet paper. It was patient and it was awake and it was very, very interested in them. "That's it," he said, hearing his voice come out higher than intended. "That's the thing." "Yes." Seluvraith pulled herself along the handholds with practiced ease, moving toward the seal. From her pack, she withdrew components that looked like they were grown rather than manufactured. Circuits that writhed in her hands, crystalline structures that sang at frequencies that made Castien's teeth ache. "The seal is degrading faster than I calculated. We have minutes, perhaps less." "What do you need me to do?" She paused in her work, her hands moving over the components with careful precision. "When I begin, I will need to open a direct connection between my bioelectric system and the seal. It will draw power from me, possibly all of it. If I lose consciousness, you must pull me away from the seal before it drains me completely. 3 minutes, no longer." "How will I know it's been 3 minutes? Time is clearly optional in this part of the temple." "You will know because I will either be dead or petrified. Both conditions are visually distinctive." She positioned the components around the seal's perimeter, her movements quick and efficient despite the lack of gravity. There is also a possibility that the entity will attempt to communicate. If it does, do not respond. Do not acknowledge it. Entities like this exist partially in concept space. If you engage with its ideas, you give it a foothold in your mind. Great, so don't think about the cosmic horror. That's definitely not going to be like telling someone not to think about pink elephants. Pink elephants are not actively trying to unmake your consciousness. The comparison is inexact. Despite everything, Castien laughed. "You know what? I'm glad you ate my dreams for 60 years. At least someone got some use out of them." Seluvraith looked at him across the spherical chamber, her dark eyes catching the flickering light from the seal. "Your dreams sustained me. But more than that, they gave me something I had not experienced in 6 centuries, companionship, even if you were not aware of it. I walked through your memories and your fears and your small joys, and I remembered what it was to not be alone." She turned back to the seal, her voice quieter. "When this is over, if we survive, I will miss them. I will miss you, even though you are here. We'll make new memories," Castien heard himself say. "The regular kind, where both parties are conscious and consenting. I would like that." She placed her hands against the seal, and the chamber exploded with light. Castien couldn't look away as energy poured from Seluvraith into the crystalline membrane, her body going rigid, her skin glowing from within like a lamp with a dying filament. The seal blazed, its veins of light burning brighter, and the filament suspending it in the chamber's center sang a note that existed somewhere between sound and pure concept. Below, the thing pressed harder against reality, and Castien felt its attention shift fully onto Seluvraith, onto the delicious bioelectric signature of a Nocthari mind offering itself as a battery. Then it noticed him. The sensation of being observed by something that old, that fundamentally alien, was like being dissected by thought alone. It looked at him and saw every fear, every regret, every moment of weakness. It saw Titan Station and the crew he hadn't saved. It saw his isolation, his carefully maintained emotional distance from anything that might require commitment. It saw how small he was, how brief, how utterly insignificant against the weight of deep time. And then, impossibly, it offered him something. The concept arrived in his mind fully formed, bypassing language entirely. The thing beneath the seal could give him Titan Station back, could rewrite that moment, let him arrive in time, let him save them all. It could erase 60 years, put him back in his ship with the data core and a functioning coolant line. It could give him every dream he'd ever had, and some he hadn't known to want. All it needed was for him to agree, to acknowledge it, to give it that small foothold in concept space that Seluvraith had warned against. Castien thought about his crew, thought about going back, undoing his survival, thought about a universe where he'd made different choices. Then he thought about Seluvraith, alone for 600 years, keeping watch over something that promised easy answers to hard questions. He thought about her sister Kelethri, frozen in stone but choosing it anyway. He thought about the asterisk Meridian Hope and its data core, proof that people had existed and mattered even if they never reached their destination. "No," he said out loud, his voice barely audible over the seal's singing. "No, I don't think so. I'm good with the timeline I've got, thanks. It's terrible and I hate it, but it's mine." The thing's attention shifted, becoming something like surprise or perhaps respect. Then it withdrew, sinking back beneath the seal as the light blazed nova bright and Seluvraith screamed. Castien launched himself across the chamber, grabbing her and pulling her away from the seal with all his strength. They tumbled through zero gravity, bouncing off walls, his arms locked around her as the seal's light reached critical intensity and then, impossibly, stabilized. The crystalline filaments settled into a steady hum. The membrane solidified, its pulse becoming strong and regular. In his arms, Seluvraith was cold, so cold he thought for a terrible moment that he'd failed. Then she gasped, her whole body convulsing, her eyes flying open. "Did it work?" she whispered. "I think so. You're not stone, which I'm taking as a win. The seal looks stable to me, but I'm not an expert in ancient containment systems." "How do you feel?" "Hollow, tired, alive." She managed a weak smile. "It spoke to you." "Yeah, offered me a do-over on my worst day. I declined." "Why?" Castien thought about it, still holding her in the strange gravity of the spherical chamber, both of them floating among the crystalline machinery that had almost killed her. "Because I'm tired of running from things," he said finally. "And because someone very wise once told me that most nobility is indistinguishable from stupidity until after the outcome is known. Figured I'd take my chances." They made their way back up through the temple's impossible architecture, Seluvraith leaning on him more than she probably wanted to admit, both of them exhausted in ways that went beyond physical. The petrified Nocthari stood silent witness to their passage, and Castien thought he saw something like approval in those frozen faces. At the temple's surface, Under the light of three impossible gas giants, Seluvraith collapsed onto the observation platform, her skin slowly returning to its normal pallor. "The cache station," she said. 3 days' journey in the shuttle I salvaged from your ship. The relay might still function. And if it doesn't, then we wait another 600 years and try again." She looked at him, exhausted but somehow lighter, as if a weight she'd carried for centuries had finally eased. Together, perhaps. Castien sat beside her, looking up at the impossible sky, thinking about data cores and proof of existence, and the strange path that had led him here. "Yeah," he said, "together sounds good."